Good morning, everyone. My name is Lee Taylor, and on behalf of our co-conveners, the Department for Behavioral Health, Developmental and Intellectual Disabilities, and Mental Health America of Kentucky, I just want to welcome everyone to Systemic Care Academy. It's our 10th anniversary, so we are super excited this year. And now I would like to welcome to today's presenters. Our session today is supporting grieving children with non-death losses, and it's my pleasure to introduce Leila Salisbury. She's the founding director of the Kentucky Center for Grieving Children and Families, Kentucky's first bereavement program focused on children and families. Leila received her master's degree from University of Kentucky. This is Leila's second year presenting at Systemic Care Academy, and we are privileged to have her with us again. Emily Johnson is the clinical program manager at the Kentucky Center for Grieving Children and Families, an adjunct instructor at University of Kentucky, and a licensed marriage and family therapist at Parker Relationship Center. Emily presents nationally and internationally. She received her Master's of Science from University of Kentucky and is a doctoral candidate with expected completion this year from University of Kentucky. So welcome, Emily and Leila.
Oh, thank you. Let me get my screen shared with us really quick. Let's see. Okay. Okay. We're good to go. Well, thank you all for joining us here. We're talking about our disenfranchised grief and non-death losses in children. So what are some best practices in support? Like Lee said, my name is Emily Johnson. I'm the clinical programs manager at Kentucky Center for Grieving Children and Families. So I handle a lot of the clinical side, and I do a lot of these trainings for our program. So I figured we could go ahead and get started for our training. Leila, if you want to give some, I have some background info on the next couple slides.
Yeah, so those of you who saw me in tandem with my daughter last time at System of Care, and I'm thrilled to be back. That was just an incredible training and an amazing experience for my daughter. Someone with lived experience in this area, so that was very meaningful to her. Grief, both death loss and certainly non-death loss, to me is one of the biggest public health crises for children in Kentucky that we're really haven't had a lot of conversations about. And I'm so grateful to Lee and the folks at the state for really over the last couple of years helping elevate and shed light on these conversations. So our center, founded in 2020, formal operations started in 21 with school-based programs. There are children and family-focused grief centers all over the country. So we didn't just come up with this model ourselves. There's a great system of colleagues across the country that we work with. But Kentucky was one of the last several states that did not have anything focused specifically on children and their families. And there are a lot of things about grief that are universal, but there are many special considerations when it comes to children and adolescents and young adults, as Emily and I are learning as we dig further into this work. So you'll hear from Emily about what's special and different about supporting grief for younger people. I think there are a lot of misconceptions. People will say children are too young to grieve, or kids are resilient, they'll just bounce back and get over it. Kids can be resilient, but grief is something they really often need help and support in navigating forward healthfully. I don't know, Emily, do you have a research slides like connecting all the outcomes?
Yes, I do. Oops.
So you'll see in a minute. So yeah, our programs do a lot of school-based. We have an online teen group, so I'm thrilled to be speaking to this audience. So if any of you are working with teens 13 to 18 who have death losses, who would be interested in participating, we've got a free 8-week online peer-led group. Emily and two teens with lived experience co-lead this group, and that's a fantastic resource. So please, if you're working with any clients for whom that might be a good support resource, please reach out to us and we'd love to enroll them. So you see here the statistics. This is why we care about this and should care about this issue. So, the bulk of our conversation today will be with non-death loss, but I think death loss often also accompanies non-death loss and some grief. And we're just looking at a huge number of our kids. The projections currently for Kentucky, when you fast forward those sibling and parent losses to age 25, are something like 250,000 kids and young adults in Kentucky. So it's a pretty significant portion of our population. And the school outcomes, that's sort of why and where we started in the schools. Nearly 20% are suspended, expelled, repeat grade. So you see direct and pretty negative impacts on school outcomes. So a lot of what we do too through education is try to work with student support staff and especially teachers in K through 12 settings to help them better understand what they're seeing, and then have some tools and techniques for better supporting those kids so they're not having some of these educational outcomes. And again, I am very glad that Emily has put together this training because and I know she's going to define difference between grief and bereavement. You know, grief can come from non-death losses, and that's going to be the focus of what we're talking about today. And I think especially for our kids in the foster care system, grief and complicated or disconnected relationships can really cause so many issues and cause all kinds of responses that are essentially grief responses. And I think the disconnect has been, since if there's not a death, we don't connect the responses those youth and adolescents are having with a grief response, when that very much is what it is. And that tends to, you know, if there's not enough attention to supporting our kids who are grieving a death loss, you know, and sometimes those kids are virtually unseen. I think, especially our kids with non-death losses and youth in the foster care system, very few people are seeing what they're experiencing as grief responses. So again, thank you to the system of care and the state for really helping elevate, you know, this conversation, because I think this happens with probably many of the children that you're working with. And hopefully after today, you'll feel better equipped to really, you know, see what's going on with them and have some particular strategies to help them navigate those feelings and normalize. I think when we don't talk about something and just hold it inside, and we feel like that's not a response we should have, or the feeling just gets bigger and there's nowhere for it to go. And then that connects with some of the mental health outcomes we don't want. For grief, there are a lot of connections between grief and substance loss, substance use, and a lot of that all ties together. So I will turn it over to Emily now. That's the background.
Thank you. I was trying to see if I had any more research slides on there for you.
Yeah, and again, if those of you are interested, we have tons of just the research slides. You know,
Yeah.
it's kind of a joke within my family. I can connect grief and loss to pretty much any other, you know, physical health issue, early death, substance use, mental health problems, school outcomes. It really is kind of this underlying thread in a lot of these things that we're trying to avoid for our kiddos. So grief, to me, again, I know that's my particular focus, but it is really at the heart in many ways of a lot of these challenges. I will, while Emily's presenting, I'll kind of watch the Q&A and the chat, and so I can be answering those in tandem. Again, you know, I am a non-clinician, just a person with lived experience. My husband died by suicide when my daughter was 5, so I've seen sort of, and we had another significant loss when she was 13. So I've seen kind of the developmental impacts and trajectories of grief at a couple different stages in, you know, in my personal life. So I am always happy to answer the, you know, what does this look like? What can, you know, parents and caregivers do? But I will also work with Emily if there are questions that are beyond my expertise. We'll turn those over to her. But feel free as Emily's going along. I'll be constantly monitoring the Q&A, and I can probably answer a lot of things.
And if there's anything that's applicable, just Layla, feel free to interrupt me and I can answer it.
All right,
Okay,
great.
perfect.
Thank you.
So thank you, Leela. Oh my goodness. Okay. I always like to get started just with some definitions. So we'll go through quite a few definitions here just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So like Leela said earlier, grief is the acute pain that accompanies a significant loss. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a death loss. So a lot of the time we associate grief with death losses, and of course we feel grief after a death loss, but death can also be, or grief can also be after another significant loss, such as parental separation, parental incarceration, divorce, a breakup, a move, anything that is a significant loss in somebody's life can bring about feelings of grief. When we're talking about death-specific grief, that's when we use the term bereavement. So that's the experience of having lost someone specifically to death. So if you notice, if it ever says bereaved children, that's talking about children who have lost somebody to death, where grief can encompass bereavement, but it also can encompass a lot of the non-death losses as well. And then mourning is the process of feeling or expressing grief. So it's kind of that external process, what we see or sometimes what we don't see. I always also like to highlight complicated and traumatic grief, especially when we're talking about non-death losses. So traumatic grief is something that can occur when a child, teen, or really anybody may have a traumatic reaction after a death or after a big loss that was very sudden and unexpected. So if it was through violence, through an accident, or through a very long-awaited, anticipated situation, that can bring about a very severe and prolonged grief response because it will also accompany trauma symptoms. So somebody might experience traumatic grief after they lost a family member to gun violence, or they could experience traumatic grief after they're separated from their home due to a situation of domestic violence. So there's many ways that traumatic grief can manifest, and it will severely get in the way of somebody's daily functioning because they have those trauma symptoms that are also accompanying the grief symptoms. When I'm talking about complicated grief, this is when grief is really interfering with adaptation. So grief just naturally is a lifelong process, and it will ebb and flow and persist for longer periods of time. But when it gets to that complicated grief phase, this is when the intense emotional pain lasts for a very long time, and an individual is really struggling to accept the reality of the change, and a future forward without this person, place, or thing just feels completely dismal and unappealing, and they just are not interested. So there's a lot of denial associated with complicated grief and mixed feelings. So disenfranchised grief is probably one of the most applicable for these non-death losses, because individuals, not just children and teens, who feel who have non-death losses often feel this sense of disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief is a grief that's not publicly acknowledged or openly mourned. So somebody might not recognize that an individual is feeling grief, or they might not even recognize that they're feeling grief. And oftentimes this can bring about really strong feelings of guilt, just because somebody will think, well, why am I so upset about this? It doesn't impact me. It shouldn't impact me this much, or I should be happy about this or excited about this, but why am I so sad? An example that I like to use for disenfranchised grief can be seen commonly in foster care settings. So if a child has been placed in a home and they're being adopted, they might feel disenfranchised grief because they are missing their birth family or the idea of their birth family, while also feeling like they should feel happy because they're being adopted, because it is a great thing. But at the same time, there is still this feeling of sadness for, they will not be connected with their birth family. And that can bring about really strong feelings of guilt because they feel excited to be adopted maybe, but also it's just a really big struggle to recognize, I may never really interact with my birth family again. So other examples of disenfranchised grief would be just loss of relationship, loss of safety and security. So if somebody has been in a situation of domestic violence, or in a situation where there is gun violence or just community violence, somebody might feel like they're not as safe as they once were, especially if there's been a spike in the violence. So they could feel a sense of grief for, I miss when I felt safe at home. Loss of community, so that can come from moving. loss of identity or questioning of current identity, and then also loss of independence. So we see this a lot in individuals with traumatic brain injuries, Alzheimer's, dementia, that type of thing. But that can affect children, but typically that's affecting the older crowd. I also want to highlight the idea of ambiguous loss because this can be very, very, very big in foster care. So ambiguous loss is very complex and also unique because there isn't really a clear sense of closure or resolution. So we might not fully understand what has happened to the person or thing that we lost. We might not know, is this person still alive or dead? Are they ever going to come back? Why did they leave? What exactly happened? So there's a lot of confusion, uncertainty. There can also be a physical presence, but psychological absence. So we see this to be true a lot for children whose caregivers are utilizing substances. So they may feel their parent is physically or caregiver is physically present, but they're not psychologically there because they're not able to take care of them. So parental incarceration is an example, chronic illnesses, substance use, military deployment. These are all reasons why an individual, especially children, would feel that ambiguous loss of, I've lost this person and I don't know if it's temporary, I don't know if it's forever, and they don't really quite know what happened. And kids often in the foster care system will feel a lot of ambiguous loss just because there are limitations with what the caseworkers, what the social workers, what foster families can tell the children. So there can be, just some confusion surrounding what has happened, and that can create a lot of extra distress on top of the grief that's already there. So what are some factors that influence disenfranchised grief or just grief in general? So I use disenfranchised grief a lot of times when I'm talking about these non-death losses. So one of the biggest things that we can count on will impact any sort of grief expression, whether it's disenfranchised or, just bereavement in general, is what are an individual's societal and cultural norms surrounding grief expression. So are they in a society where emotion expression is encouraged, or are they encouraged to be strong, don't show your emotions, you're not supposed to cry, that type of thing? How is that handled? And especially if there is a non-death loss because of something like parental incarceration or a child being put in a foster placement due to, family substance use or abuse, they might feel a lot of shame. So they may feel like they can't or don't want to tell people what's going on because they don't want to be judged. So that can create some hesitancies around expressing that grief. There's also the issue of stoicism versus emotional expression. So sometimes somebody who is stoic, who's not really expressing their emotions, they might be falsely labeled as somebody who is handling it well, where somebody who is more emotional and talks about it might be labeled as not handling it well. So basically, whatever our expectation is for how somebody should be grieving will impact what they express to you. So it's really difficult sometimes to recognize what attitudes we have surrounding grief, but it's good to be aware of that because we don't want to put these ideals onto somebody and make them feel like they can't express their grief with us. There's also a lot of gender stereotypes that occur during grief as well. A lot of times, younger girls and women are expected to be much more emotional, talk about their emotions. They have to express their feelings, where younger men, especially, younger Black men and younger boys are taught, boys don't cry, don't show your emotions, try to do things to actively heal rather than talking about it. So there can be some gender stereotypes as well that can be damaging. There can also be a lot of stigma and misconceptions that surround specifically non-death losses. So there's what I call the just a pet mentality. So here, this is essentially just a way of saying, oh, I know that you're really sad, but it was just your cat. People sometimes will have this idea of it was just this, it could have been worse, which, that sometimes people use that to comfort, but it's not entirely helpful just because all losses can feel big and relevant. And so sometimes we can minimize non-death losses of, oh, well, you know, you're in a better place now. Your birth family was dangerous, so you shouldn't be sad about missing your mom. Or, you know, your parents fought all the time, so divorce was really a better option. So sometimes people might minimize non-death losses, and that can make it really, really difficult for those, especially children struggling with non-death losses, to express themselves and also feel like they're allowed to feel how they feel. And unfortunately, if they feel like what they're feeling is wrong, they're probably going to suppress it, which oftentimes children, adults, everybody alike suppresses grief in general. So add some shame onto it, and that's just going to make it so much harder. Also, whatever family dynamics and support systems are available to the child is going to influence how they experience any type of grief, especially non-death losses. So what are the caregiver attitudes towards grief? Do they have that just a pet mentality of, oh, well, you know, your life is better here, you shouldn't be sad about this? Or are they okay in acknowledging, okay, this was a big loss for you and I understand? Is there even emotional support available? A child who has caregivers, teachers, friends who are there to support them emotionally is going to handle their grief vastly different than a child who does not have any emotional support at all. So those two things are very important to be aware of. And then also, are there any sort of cultural or religious beliefs surrounding grief? So do we have any beliefs on how we should express grief, what grief should look like, just being very aware of that. And all of these factors can influence these non-death losses and grief. Okay. So I always like to highlight some emotional impacts for grief. So especially with this disenfranchised grief, non-death losses, there can be a lot of emotions. So I highlight anxiety, depression, and anger, but really there are any emotions. You can see anything across the board. But these three are typically the ones that we see the most, but I don't want everybody to think that we're limited to these, if that makes sense. So anxiety is huge because children who have experienced a non-death loss may have a lot of anxiety, especially if they haven't received much closure. So they can see excessive worry, they can be very restless and sometimes fearful, so afraid of, am I safe here? Am I going to get moved to another place? What's going to happen to me? And sometimes this restlessness that we talk about can show up almost by way of hyperactivity. So kids can get mislabeled as having issues with attention or hyperactivity, ADHD, just because they're really struggling to manage that anxiety, and it manifests almost as them seeming hyperactive. They may also feel very overwhelmed about just their general emotional state and struggle to feel like they can trust what's going to happen in the future. So that uncertainty and instability that they've had that's led them through this non-death loss might lead them in a space where they feel like, okay, I have to anticipate for the other shoe to drop. I was removed from my home and now I've been placed in this foster home. Let me wait for the other shoe to drop for when I'm going to be moved to another one. So these kids are always kind of in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode to where they're just ready to react because they're trying to protect themselves and they feel such high levels of anxiety. Depression is also a very common feeling. So depression and intense sadness. This is a little bit different just from sadness because this often includes a sense of hopelessness. So feeling like they don't have meaning, feeling like they can't engage in anything just because they don't want to get their hopes up. They don't think things will get better. They feel very strong despair. So these children may start to really withdraw from their social circles, from activities. They may become much quieter in school, especially when we look at teens and even into younger adults. They'll be walking around with their hood on, don't want to interact with anybody, kind of almost have like a don't mess with me look. A lot of that is because they're just going through that social withdrawal. And then finally, anger. So anger is a very normal expression during grief, but I always like to tell kids that I work with, anger is a perfectly okay emotion because a lot of times it has been villainized, but it is not okay to hurt ourselves, hurt another person, or damage property. So I always make that clear, but also just be prepared as somebody who works with children who are experiencing grief and of any kind, that they may feel intense feelings of anger or frustration in response to these non-death losses, especially if they don't have answers. This anger may be directed at themselves, being upset about why am I so sad about this situation. They could direct it towards another person, so towards a caregiver or somebody involved, a caseworker, anybody. Or they could be angry about the circumstances surrounding their loss. Well, if this one person hadn't done this, then I wouldn't have had to leave my home. If this one person hadn't have done this, then my parent wouldn't have gone to jail. There's a lot of anger that can happen there, and it's very normal. So that's something that we will get into later, is how to allow kids to honor their anger while also not letting it get completely out of hand to the point to where somebody is in danger. So there are a lot of behavioral impacts as well, similar to emotional impacts. These are not, we're not limited to these behavioral impacts, but this is typically what we see most commonly. So we see a lot, especially in earlier developmental stage, we see behavioral regression. So this is a way of these kids trying to cope with their grief, and this can show up in adolescents and teens as well. But a lot of times regression, no matter what age, shows up as a sense of clinginess in a way. So they are struggling with separation anxiety. So don't want to be away from their people. They want to make sure that everybody that they know is okay, because they're afraid maybe I'll get separated from this person too. Maybe something bad will happen if I'm not around them. And then for younger children, a lot of times we see increases in bedwetting and temper tantrums. Temper tantrums are big just because toddlers, early childhood, they have temper tantrums already naturally because their emotions just feel way too big to handle. So if you add something very complex like grief and a non-death loss, that's only going to make them feel even more overloaded emotionally, which will lead to more temper tantrums. So we will see withdrawal. Withdrawal is probably a lot of what we see in teens and older adults. So, not older adults, so teens and those early adulthood, so 18 to 25. So they may withdraw socially and emotionally. And a lot of times this is done as a form of self-protection. So I'm going to isolate myself because every time I get close to somebody, they leave. Or I don't feel like the people that I'm close with, that I can trust them to respond to my emotions well, so I may as well just not talk at all. Or they feel very, very misunderstood. And they don't want to be around people who will make them feel even more different or even more misunderstood. So because of that, we'll withdraw. And then finally, we'll see some, acting out behaviors. So a lot of this shows up as defiance, potentially aggression, or rule breaking. So these are a way for children to sense a regain of control back into their lives. So this can be anything from, not behaving in a classroom, trying to not doing their homework, to substance use and abuse, or even just more passive defiance of, you know what, I'm not going to wear my seatbelt because it doesn't matter. These people tell me to do it and they haven't protected me, so I'm just going to do what I want. So we can see some of these defiant behaviors show up as well in grief. So finally, I also like to go through educational impacts. Children are typically in schools and spend most of their time during school or in school while they're experiencing grief. So of course, education is going to take a pretty solid hit. So one of the biggest struggles that we'll see is difficulty concentrating. So when an individual is grieving any type of significant loss, it doesn't have to be a death loss, it puts the brain under a lot of emotional distress. So because of that, the prefrontal cortex starts to function at a significantly lower level, and we will go into essentially low brain thinking, which is survival mode. So because of this, learning about algebra, learning spelling words, whatever, that does not seem so important to kids, and it's also not cognitively as available. So they may struggle to focus in school. So because of that, there can be issues with completing assignments, following instructions, or retaining and regurgitating information for tests and exams. Also, to go hand in hand with the withdrawal, there can be struggles with peer relationships. So this can be because of a couple reasons. So a lot of times we think peer relationships will struggle because of social withdrawal, but also a lot of kids will feel very misunderstood or alienated from their friends, because sometimes kids will say who've experienced a loss, not just a death loss, but any sort of significant loss, you know, my friends don't understand what it's like when something bad happens, so I just feel different. So because of that, they might feel like they can't really talk to their friends about things that might make them distant. And also there's a lot of bullying that accompanies grief as well. And I know, Leila, you have some stories about how bullying can come about in grief. So this can be for death losses and non-death losses alike.
Yeah, that's very common, you know, unfortunately, excuse me. You know, the depending on the age of the child, bullying for any type of difference is unfortunately prevalent, and definitely bullying for death losses, but also the non-death losses. Again, you know, if a bereaved child feels different, the child who's been put in a foster placement feels different because they don't necessarily want to go into a big explanation with their peers about why they're in foster care. And usually many of those children get placed in care because of issues that are stigmatized, whether it's, you know, substance abuse, physical abuse. Like, no one wants to go into that story.
Right.
And, you know, unfortunately, few of those kids from their peers, or frankly, sometimes from their teachers, they don't feel a lot of understanding, or they feel like when they do start talking about those things, their peers and also sometimes the teachers and the adults around them get very uncomfortable. So these kids, you know, can read the social cues, and they're like, oh, when I talk about this, everyone gets weird. Or, you know, peers will say directly, don't bring this up. Like, this makes us uncomfortable. We don't know what to say. So they do feel very isolated. And then, you know, the bullying kids will latch on to whatever that thing is, point of difference, and use that. So unfortunately, that's common. And teachers often don't, because of their own complicated feelings about losses and these stigmatized issues, they often aren't in a place necessarily to really make the child feel supported. You know, they don't know how to respond to that. They're uncomfortable with it. And so the lesson the child takes away is, I deserve to be bullied because this is just what happens to kids who are in my situation, because they aren't seeing any information to the contrary. You know, they just feel like, well, this is something that comes with this, and I just have to put up with it.
Yeah. And I wanted to take just a quick pause, just because I saw a really great question in the chat that I just wanted to go ahead and address. So Margot with DJJ, she asked, she said that she sees a lot of acting out behaviors in youth that have been victimized, especially victims of sexual violence. They seem to be grieving the person that they were able to be prior to the violent incident. And how can we help those youth feel safe? So that is, you know, absolutely an issue where we would see potential acting out behaviors just because there is that feeling of, I'm not the same person anymore. Like you said, Margot, and a lot of times individuals who have been victimized feel like their autonomy and their rights and their decision making was taken away from them. So we will see them behave in a way that's very defiant in order to try to get that sense of control back. So a lot of this acting out is just in order of, let me try to get my control back. And of course, it's a little bit misled just because they've gone through something very traumatic. So when we're working with these youth to try to help them feel safe, I think it's important to just try to take their story and discuss it with them. Try not to force them to talk about it. So creating a good rapport before really working and getting into the nitty-gritty. The first session that you're working with them will probably be helpful, just building that trust. And then also, whenever you are working with them, giving them choices. So a lot of victims feel like they were stripped of their ability to choose. So it is really empowering for both, youth and adult victims to give them choices for, what do we want to talk about today? What do we want to do today? Is giving them, do you want to do this or this? So they feel like they still have some autonomy and that they are essentially still able to make decisions and take control of their life back, if that's helpful at all. So Margot, thank you for that question. I think that that was a really great point to bring up as well. And I like how you mentioned that these youth are often grieving the person that they were, which absolutely, they were grieving their life when they still felt safe, the person when they didn't have to think about this type of act. So I really appreciate that question a lot. Thank you.
And this really happens. Anyone who's experienced a death loss, adults or kids, they'll say, I've heard young people say, I just want to, when do I get to go back to being the person that I was? And the answer, fortunately, is you are no longer that person. That's one of the really hard things about grief. So, Emily, I know you do some activities with the kids.
Yes.
Talking about like focusing on identifying points of strength in their personalities, or helping, even if they do feel different, kind of reminding them, what is it that you like about yourself? What is it that you're good at? Is that sort of helpful for kids in these situations?
Yes. Also reminding them of their strengths and everything as well can be very helpful. Thank you. Okay, so we will go back to, I'm also monitoring the chat as well. So if any other questions come up, I will also address those, and I'm sure Leila, you can get some in the chat as well. But finally, finishing up the educational impacts, because there are struggles with concentrating, learning new information, struggles with peer relationships, there's often a really strong impact on school performance. So emotional distress in general makes school very difficult. And we can often see a decline in grades, attendance, and just overall school achievement. So children who have experienced losses are often, more likely to become truant, drop out, and have lower higher educational achievement, just because a lot of times these behaviors don't necessarily fall very much under the radar in schools. So a teacher, they have so many students, they might not know how to recognize that a student is struggling because of grief and not, just because they don't care about school. So unfortunately, there are so many kids, especially with non-death losses, that just completely slip through the cracks. Their grades go down, they stop going to school, and, it just really impacts their educational career. Okay. So I always like to give some intel into how can we recognize grief. So when we're looking at grief, a lot of times, especially if it's a recent loss, we'll see a lot of shock and disbelief. So somebody might not be able to wrap their head around it. They might say, this feels like a dream. I can't believe this is happening. Younger kids might say this is a nightmare. And I will, divide this up by age a little bit later. But the youngest kids, 0 to 5, they might not have too much of a reaction as well, just because their brains aren't hardwired to understand longevity yet. So they might not fully understand what is happening. Intense sadness and or feeling of depression, anger, like I said, anger is a very, very common emotion in all forms of grief, not just non-death losses, but death losses and any other type of loss. A lot of times we feel angry because these losses were so out of our control. There's strong feelings of guilt, feelings of isolation, increased risk-taking behaviors like we've discussed. And then we'll also see a lot of physical symptoms. So headaches, stomach aches, sleep disturbances, appetite disturbances, weakened immune system. So we're getting strep, we're getting colds, we're getting the flu, getting sick much more commonly. I always like to say you can run from your emotions, but you can't hide, because physical symptoms a lot of times will show up if we are not acknowledging emotional symptoms. And the difficult thing with children is they might not necessarily recognize that their headaches, their stomach aches are connected to these feelings of grief or this feeling of sadness that they have, but we will start to notice there will be a little bit more patterned behaviors in the headaches or the stomach aches, that it will be much more frequent rather than, every once in a blue moon. Of course, every child and teen has a day maybe where they don't want to go to school, so their stomach hurts, but they'll have stomach aches once or twice a week, and there'll be frequent flyers in the nurse's office. So those would be kids that would be good to check in on, just to see, have there been any big changes that have happened recently, any big emotions that they're struggling with dealing with that are manifesting much more physically. Because a lot of times kids don't know. They just know that they feel awful and they have a headache, and maybe they need to go home. So it's important for us as individuals who work with youth just to be aware that things can manifest more physically than emotionally sometimes as well. So now we're getting into some of the symptoms. So I'm going to divide it by early childhood, middle childhood, so elementary age, and then adolescence. So when we're looking at symptoms in ages 3 to 5, this is where we see a lot of the behavioral regression. So they will start to go back towards earlier developmental stages as a way of coping with their grief. So a lot of times we'll think that kids at this age don't know what grief is, or won't know that this person's missing or that this has happened, but they do recognize that something is different and something is off and something's unsettled. So we'll see them revert back. They might start sucking their thumb again. They might want to be a 4-year-old might all of a sudden want to be held like a baby. They might start wetting their bed. You might have a 5-year-old who knows how to get their socks and shoes Velcroed, all of a sudden is asking for more help. So we'll see some of that behavioral regression, which here is very, very common in early childhood. We'll also see appetite disruption. So we can see changes in eating habits. So some kids will eat significantly less or eat significantly more. So if a child's eating significantly less, a lot of times that is just due to that feeling of malaise. So stomach aches, not feeling like hungry at all because they feel like they're going to throw up. Or a child might start to seek comfort in food, seek, that instant gratification from food. So we can see appetite go either way. We'll also see a lot of separation anxiety in this age. So these children, they might not fully be able to verbalize or fully understand what is happening. But again, like I said, they know something is different. So we will see that they become much more fearful of being separated from their people, from their caregivers. They may want to start sleeping with their caregiver. They may want to have their caregiver come to school with them. They may not want to be away from their caregiver on the playground. So there will be a lot of struggles with separation anxiety. And then also there will be temper tantrums. So distress in this age, especially when we're closer to like 2 to 3 years old, they often express these big emotions through temper tantrums just because it feels so overwhelming that they don't really know what else to do. Temper tantrums are natural for this age because they don't have the skills or the cognition to totally regulate their emotions yet. So they're still learning. And we can see temper tantrums increase during losses, especially in situations or surrounding people that remind them of this big loss. A note that I also want to add here is when you are, I'll probably highlight this again when we're talking about how to talk to children, but when you are working with children ages 3 to 5, they will also ask a lot of questions. So if you are a foster parent and you have a 3-year-old in your custody, anybody who's 3 to 5, they might ask you over and over and over, when do I get to see my mom again? When do I get to see this person again? Am I going to be adopted? They don't fully understand, so they'll just ask the same question over and over. Or what happens if you leave too? Then what happens? So they're starting to be worried about their safety, but it shows up as some separation anxiety and just that repetitive questioning. And I don't want you all as, caregivers, practitioners, whatever your role is, to think that you are doing something wrong, because you are not. If they keep asking questions, they will ask the questions for as long as they need to. And it's very developmentally appropriate for where they are cognitively for them to keep asking these questions. It might be, concerning, but it is natural. When we're looking at symptoms in elementary and middle school age kids, so those ages 6 to 12, so right after early childhood and then right up to before we hit adolescence, this is when we really start to see the impacts of grief on school performance. So this is really when we would see academic decline. So we'll see potential lower grades, decreased participation, and that struggle with concentrating in class. So as school starts to get harder, especially as they get older, academic decline may become much more prevalent. And sometimes one of the first ways that we'll notice a child has experienced a big traumatic event or a big emotional event, whether it's a loss or anything else, is because they start to struggle in school. So academic decline is a good indicator here that there's something that needs to be looked at. We also will see children start to withdraw here. So some of them will withdraw socially and emotionally. So they'll distance themselves from not just peers, but also family members or caregivers. And they may spend time just alone. So they may not want to be around people, or we can see that they may withdraw emotionally and only want to be around people so that they don't have to feel their emotions. So withdrawal can kind of show up in a couple different ways, but this is when we really start to see kids withdraw. A lot of times we do just see that social withdrawal. There's also changes in behavior. So we can see increased irritability, increased impulsivity, and just some, instability in moods. So emotion regulation, when you're feeling really big feelings, just even for adults, can be difficult. So if you add this into a child whose brain is still developing, emotion regulation is going to be very difficult. So we might see more behavioral outbursts. We might see more of these behavioral outbursts that seem very incongruent to whatever, set them off. So they break their pencil and they end up throwing the desk. That's obviously not a congruent response, but they may have so much other emotion built up that we'll see more outbursts like that. We also can see some of that impulsivity, which again is where sometimes grief can be misdiagnosed as ADHD, especially if there's hyperactivity and struggle with emotion regulation as well. Finally, again, these children also will still show physical symptoms. So specifically headaches and stomach aches and just feeling really exhausted are most of what you end up seeing. So there may be a child who's always falling asleep at school, or who always has a headache or a stomach ache, and they're constantly in the nurse's office. So these kids, they probably don't recognize, again, that these emotions and emotional distress that they have is causing them to feel sick, but it does end up becoming much more patterned. So if there is a child that you're working with that's always feeling sick, always, going to the nurse's office or telling you, I have a headache, I have a stomach ache, pay attention, see what's going on. A lot of times children might start to feel sick on days of birthdays, anniversaries of a loss, that type of thing. So it's something that is good to be aware of. And then finally, once we get into adolescence, one of the other big symptoms here is emotion dysregulation. So puberty already makes teens feel pretty intense emotions, and add grief or any other trauma, difficult emotion on top of that, and that's just going to magnify that struggle with emotional dysregulation. These feelings are going to feel so intense, ranging from sadness to anger and resentment, and it can just be way too much to handle. And a lot of times these kids will say that they feel completely overwhelmed, they don't know how to handle their emotions, or that they feel just completely burned out and they don't want to feel anything at all. And sometimes that's when we can see kids start to self-medicate in effort to just kind of numb out. There's also a lot of social isolation here. So kids, especially our teens, they don't want to be different. And like Leila said a little bit ago, it can be really difficult to go into the story of, oh, how'd you end up in foster care? How did your family member end up in prison? And sometimes they just won't want to talk about it. So they'll withdraw from social interactions and just become very isolated because they feel misunderstood, or because I don't want to go into this with somebody, so I'd just rather be alone. We also see risk-taking behaviors, usually as an effort to try to regain control of their lives or cope with intense emotions. So typically we see reckless behavior sometimes as a way of trying to regain control, especially with violence victims. And we see this a lot for sexual violence victims. Sometimes they will start to become a little bit more sexual as a way to try to regain control of their sexuality that they feel was stolen from them. So that could fall under reckless behavior. We can see self-harm and then substance abuse as a way to try to manage those intense emotions. This really starts to rear its head during adolescence. And then also decline in academic performance. So they may feel disconnected from peers and teachers and just stop caring about school, on top of all of the dysregulation that's happening emotionally. And, you know, they're just kind of more focused on how can I get through the day? And when you're feeling that dysregulated and that overwhelmed, algebra probably doesn't seem that important. So unfortunately, if a child is grieving something or a teen's grieving something and it's going unsupported, they probably will start to struggle in school. And also just, you know, completely anecdotally, in the groups that I've done in high schools, a lot of the biggest issues that we see are truancy. So there are some kids that might get on the bus to go to school, they get to school and they just leave because they don't want to be there. They don't want to be around their peers. Nobody understands them. So that is also kind of tied into why we'll see decline in academic performance as well, is just because, you know, they don't feel comfortable going to school. So identifying bereavement can be very difficult already. And there's even more challenges that we have identifying this disenfranchised grief or these non-death losses. And a lot of this is because there's just not necessarily clear external signs. So unlike a death loss, there's not a clear, this child was missing from school for 2 weeks because their grandma died, the community had a candlelight, you know, there's not as much sign that would signal, hey, this person might be going through something and struggling. So because of this, it can be very difficult for caregivers, educators, and just individuals who work with youth practitioners to recognize and maybe even validate these losses of, you know, it is really hard to have a parent incarcerated. It is really hard to be separated from your family, just because we might not know, especially in school settings, teachers might not know that one of their students is in foster care or one of their students is in kinship care, and that's created a lot of, you know, feelings of loss for them. There's also masking of grief symptoms. So even with bereavement loss, children will mask grief symptoms just because they don't want to be different. They don't want to be judged by other people. So they will mask them as a way to protect themselves. And when we're looking at non-death losses, a lot of people, like I said earlier, will tend to minimize this loss. So, you know, kids just frankly don't really want to hear that they shouldn't feel sad about it, or they feel guilty that they feel sad about something that everybody's telling them they should feel any other way about. So because of this, they will just mask it. They'll act like everything's fine and they just don't want to be different. And then finally, there's limited awareness and understanding surrounding non-death losses. So it's pretty clear that there will be grief after a death loss, but non-death losses are complicated because one person might feel a lot of grief from one non-death loss, and then another person might feel relieved or might feel completely different about it. So there's not really any sort of standardization of this situation right here will definitely cause grief. So because of that, it can be really difficult to identify. And also, you know, we don't know exactly, a lot of times caregivers don't, and providers might not know exactly how non-death losses impact children. So it can go completely under the radar. But what we do know is that these non-death losses do trigger the same grief reactions as a death loss, and that they can be, and often are, just as significant and distressful as a death loss. So now we're going to go into more of the takeaway, the practicality. I've given you all a lot of information in a short amount of time, so I apologize. But now we're going to get into more of the how to work with a grieving child. So this can be in, any capacity, whether you're a foster parent, whether you're a caseworker, whether you're a therapist, any sort of provider, teacher, whatever it may be. These are some great tips and tools to help you work with grieving children. So one of the biggest things, especially if there's been any sort of violence, any sort of mistrust going on in their life, is to create a safe and trusting environment. So allow these children and teens, the youth, just to express their emotions without judgment. Sometimes kids will say stuff to try to shock you, just to test and see, are you a safe person? Can you handle it? Essentially, really. So trying to listen and without judgment and just say, you know what, that sounds like that's really difficult. I'm glad that you feel comfortable sharing this with me. So, being aware that sometimes we might do stuff for shock value because they want to see if you're safe. So allowing them to freely express their emotions, of course, with limitations. If they're hurting somebody, hurting themselves, or damaging anything, different story. But outside of that, giving them the freedom to be angry and happy at the same time, or sad and just frustrated, just giving them that space. And then also utilizing active listening to show engagement. And I do have just a recap on active listening just on the next slide. I'm sure most of you all are familiar with it, but I have some go-to responses that you can have when working with grieving children that might be helpful. It's also important for us to acknowledge the grief. So sometimes, especially, when we're working with a kid, maybe as a teacher or just in any setting, we might not want to bring up the loss because we're afraid if I say something about it, it's going to make it worse. But that's actually not the case. So a lot of times kids are showing their behaviors in nonverbal ways in hopes that somebody will notice and ask them about it. So it's perfectly okay to acknowledge, hey, I know that you had this loss and I want to see how you're doing. Validate their experience. So many who struggle with these disenfranchised and non-death losses often feel invalidated or feel like they shouldn't be sad about it. So highlight that significance. If, a child's being adopted, say, you know what, it's okay that you still really miss your birth family. I know that being adopted can be exciting, but it also can be sad too. And it's okay to feel both. So acknowledging the grief in situations. And then also be aware that if this child has any sort of recent behavioral changes that seem to have just a sudden onset or are newer, just kind of follow up with that and see, hey, I noticed this is going on. How have you been? Or just ask them, how have you been? It is perfectly okay and recommended to check in with the kids, have a conversation. A lot of the times they might not want to talk to you about it, especially teens, but if you continue to check in on them, sometimes that alone can be enough, or, a lot of times eventually they do end up opening up. And finally, also make referrals to community resources and extra mental health supports when necessary. Sometimes, we all have our limitations no matter what our role is. So understanding that working with children who are grieving is best when it is a multi-person effort. So trying to find the best referral, and sometimes the best way to support somebody is you can continue to support them, but you can bring another person in on referral to kind of help fill in the gaps where it's needed. I also think it's very, very important for us just to, especially if you're working in a foster care setting, to address loss and transitions. So acknowledging any sort of past losses. So it's okay to call out past losses. This allows children to make space to process their emotions. So, saying, hey, I know it was really hard the last time you left your last placement. And, it's okay if you feel sad about that. So just acknowledging that. Preparing for transitions. And this is especially true if you are working with a child who's in respite care. So preparing for, giving them the information of, I don't know exactly how long you'll be here, but this is kind of my best guess. Giving them as much information as is appropriate. So like I said, you may not have control over some changes, but try to anticipate and prepare for transitions as much as possible. So if you've been told you'll be able to go back home in 2 weeks, just say, hey, I don't want to count on it, but this is what we've been told. So, let's go from there and see what happens. And then also finally, providing continuity of care in relationships. So finding ways to keep in touch with the person that they lost or were separated from. So whether this means, if it's a foster child, are they still allowed to FaceTime with their parent? Or do they want to, carry around like a remembrance rock of something that reminds them of this person that they've lost? How can they keep in touch, either literally keep in touch with them, or, just feel some sort of spiritual connection to them? And then also encouraging healthy communication. So encouraging them to express their emotions as they see fit and as they come up. So now we're going to get into more of the active listening portion. So when we're utilizing active listening, we are listening to understand rather than just respond. So this creates a opportunity for much deeper connection. In conversations, it shows the individual that we are talking to that we are listening and that we're very engaged. So it's a great way to have deeper conversations, ask about struggles, ask them what type of support is needed, giving them choices. So inquire about these potential struggles and ask, do they know what would be helpful? Some kids, especially younger ones, even teens, they may not know what they need. So this is when reassurance is huge, saying, it's okay if you don't know what you need. I'm here to help you. What if we tried A or B? So giving them those choices will promote safety and feeling like they have control. So more often than not, there's kids either are going to know exactly what they want, or they're going to have no idea and they're going to need direction. So either way, giving them reassurance of, I'm here to help you, I'm going to be here for you, and giving those choices will be really helpful. And then also acknowledging and validating your feelings. So I understand that this divorce has been incredibly challenging for you. It's okay to feel a range of emotions. Anger is a very normal response in this situation. So saying, I understand blank situation has been tough. It's okay to feel however you feel. Anybody in this situation would feel that way. This is a very normal response. So making sure that you're validating those feelings. And I always like to highlight that, all feelings are valid, all responses are not. So if somebody is angry and, punching a wall, you could say, anger is a very normal response in this situation, but it might not be so helpful to punch walls. We don't want to damage property. So it's still okay to redirect as well. And just because you validate their feelings, that doesn't mean that you're validating any sort of negative action. It just means, this feeling, totally understand why you would feel that way in this situation. And that is really, really helpful, because a lot of times with non-death losses, kids, teens, adults alike, they all feel like they can't feel how they feel. So getting that validation of, of course you're really sad about this, is going to go a very, very long way. So when we look at best practices for communication, there are a few things that I find very helpful. And one of the biggest things is to maintain clear and transparent communication with the child. So if you don't know the answer to a question, it's okay to say that you don't know. Encourage them to ask questions and answer in an age-appropriate manner. So, with foster care situations and, some situations where there's justice involvement, courts involved, we might not, depending on our role, be able to tell them all of the answers, because we either don't know or we've been instructed not to. So if that's the case, we could say, I'm not sure I can answer this question, but why don't you ask so-and-so, or let's talk to this person about it. So try to direct it to somebody who could have a better answer for them. And then when we're talking about death, when we're talking about how to maintain clear and transparent communication, this is when you would say, like, this person died, they're dead. We don't want to use euphemisms of this person's going away for a while, or this person went to sleep, just because that can be very, very confusing for kids. So try to be as clear and transparent as possible and as you're allowed to. Helping children also set realistic expectations. So this is huge for ambiguous loss and especially in foster care situations. So some kids will get in their mind, you know what, I'm just going to be here for 2 months and then I'm going to go home and live with mom. And that could happen, but you also might know that it probably won't happen. Maybe a child saying that and they're in a foster to adopt situation. So trying to help them set realistic expectations for what's going to happen. And if you don't know the answer, it's okay to state that you're unsure, but we'll figure it out together. And I'm here for you as we figure it out. And then also checking in with children consistently. So even if they don't seem like they want to talk to you, just check in with them. Sometimes having a trusted adult to talk to is just all the option that kids need. So again, they might not really want to have the conversation with you, but knowing that you care really will make a huge, huge difference for these kids. So I want to stop really quick because I just saw a question in the chat from Emily. How do we answer questions about substance abuse for kids ages 6 to 8 when they want questions about why dad went to jail? So we do have some handouts as well that go over how to explain substance use, substance abuse to children, overdoses to children. So essentially, what I always do here is when we're talking about substance abuse is just saying, first of all, if you were allowed to tell them, you can say, your dad was taking because addiction is an illness. So your mind was sick and he was taking a substance that was illegal to try to, help him feel better. Or your dad started taking a substance that was illegal. And because that substance was illegal, he got in trouble and that's how he ended up in jail. So trying to put it in a way of that's not totally blaming of the father and just kind of highlighting, hey, this is an issue. Addiction was an issue. It led him to use a substance that altered his brain, but unfortunately that substance was illegal and, he went to jail because of it. So explaining it in that way can also be helpful. And like Leila just said in the chat, Illuna is a great resource for addiction and grief. So they have a lot of great talking points to look at. How can you have this conversation with children? So I would also definitely look there as well. So how do we build resilience? And did I skip a slide? Let me make sure. I feel like I skipped a slide. No, I did not. Okay. So how do we build resilience in these children? So grief is a lifelong process, no matter what type of loss. So unfortunately, we can't tell the child, okay, in 2 years, this grief is going to go away. You will feel so much better and, nothing is going to hurt you again. That is not the case at all. So essentially what we want to do is how can we encourage resilience? How can we encourage these children to feel like they are able to handle difficult situations that come to them? So 2 of the biggest things that I will always say is to encourage healthy coping strategies. So physical exercise, dance, artistic expression is huge. A lot of the activities that we do in our grief groups are very art and play therapy based, just because that's a great way for children to work through emotions without necessarily having to talk about them. Journaling, also using relaxation techniques such as deep breathing or mindfulness exercises. The goal here is to help children calm their minds and bodies during times of distress, rather than kind of feeding into that sense of feeling overwhelmed. Also, finally, providing practical advice. So sometimes it's easy to say it'll get better with time, time will heal all wounds. But if we can provide a child with choices and a very real practical option, that's going to go much farther. So when you feel X, you can go do Y. So explaining when a skill can be utilized. So giving them very concrete examples of when you feel angry, you can go scream into your pillow. If you get sad at school, you can go down to the counselor's office. If you feel sad at home, why don't you call your friend who always makes you laugh? So there's ways to offer advice for when you feel this, here's a solution. Here's something you could try. Just because if you give them advice of it'll get better with time or something that feels much more abstract, that's not going to be entirely helpful for the children at all. So having more of the action items will end up being very helpful, and it will also be something that they can take away and apply to where maybe if they feel angry in another point in their life that's not because of grief, they can say, okay, whenever I'm angry, it helps when I do this. So they'll also learn coping skills just to utilize in general when working with difficult emotions. So how do we handle emotional moments? So allow your client, the child, whoever you're working with, to express their emotions and just acknowledge that expression. So this is a very great time to utilize active listening. Create a safe and supportive environment. So this can be done by maintaining clear communication and empathy. And under clear communication also includes boundaries. So letting them know what is okay and what is not okay in your space. So I understand that you're angry, but I'm not okay with you breaking my vases, or I'm not okay with hitting. So letting them know, I'm here and willing to listen to you, but here's, what is not okay. Also balancing reality with compassion. So you don't have to fix this for the child. You don't have to fix this for somebody. Providing support and empathy can go a very long way. So recognizing this isn't something that maybe you can fix, but if you can support the child, that will be very, very helpful. So I also like to bring up cultural considerations, just because there are so many diverse expressions of grief. There's not really a right or wrong way to grieve. Unfortunately, grief is not something that comes with an instruction book on here's how to do it. Theorists have tried over the years, but unfortunately, it is not a universal standardized process that once you go through these 5 stages, you'll be better. Grief expressions can, and honestly, they will vary greatly from person to person. We'll also see these grief expressions vary in 2 children who come from the same circumstance in the same family. 2 siblings might respond to being in foster care in 2 completely different ways. So recognizing that there are multiple ways to express grief. Also avoid assumptions about the grieving process. So don't, assume that don't assume that grief has a timeline. So don't think, okay, this will be better in a year. It might be better, but it also might not. And, grief ebbs and flows. It's something that's very difficult that somebody deals with over a lifetime. So recognizing that it isn't on a timeline and that there are all emotions possible. Somebody may feel relieved after a loss, even, especially if there's a situation of abuse or neglect. They might feel relieved and sad at the same time. There can be multiple emotions where 2 things can be true at once. And this is difficult for children and especially teenagers to realize. You can be heartbroken and relieved at the same time. So recognizing that, and then also adapting to how you work with children based on cultural considerations. So just being aware of your own biases and attitudes and see how could this impact how I'm working with these children. Do I expect grieving individuals to respond this way? And how will that impact how I approach them? So just kind of doing a self-check and just being aware of could this impact my relationship with the child that I'm working with. So I always like to give some what not to say, because I feel like this is a big topic. Everybody just wants to know, okay, what don't I say? What are absolute no-nos? What are some things that maybe I shouldn't say to somebody who's experiencing grief? So try to avoid too much personal experience that you've had with loss, because although this is coming from a good place, this can come off as insensitive if, a child is coming up to you saying they're really struggling with the fact that their parent is incarcerated. And then you go in and talk about what it was like for you when your parent was incarcerated. At that point, it's not really helpful for them because they think you've just made it about you. So it's perfectly okay to say something like, you know what, I know how hard it was for me when my parent was incarcerated, but I don't know how you feel. So what has it been like for you? so that can share the idea that I have a shared experience, but I want to hear how it's been for you. Don't say things like, time heals all wounds, it could be so much worse, or at least you have blank, just because that unfortunately completely minimizes any sort of feelings that somebody has. Don't immediately change the subject or actively avoid the conversation. It's perfectly okay to have the conversation, and it's okay that the conversation's uncomfortable. That's perfectly fine. And don't imply that the person should get over it or focus on moving on. When somebody talks to you about grief or any emotional struggle that they have, try to just really meet them where they are and allow them to have that free emotional expression that they need, because that support's going to be just really invaluable to children, adults, teens, anybody. So I also like to highlight self-care for individuals who are working with grieving children. So be aware of your own sensitivities and loss experiences. These can come up when you're working with or taking care of a child who has, or youth who's experienced a loss, whether it's a death loss or any other significant loss. So just being aware of things that might come up for you and realize just what do I need from myself to feel taken care of so that I have the bandwidth to take care of this child. Set clear boundaries with children and teens. This promotes safety for all. So just because something bad has happened to somebody, that doesn't mean that they don't have any rules or no rules apply. A lot of these kids really are craving structure. So it's okay to set boundaries of, you know what, I know that you're really upset about being separated from your birth family, but I do still need you to help me with the chores. So if you don't mind, we can do the dishes together or something like that. Seek supervision or consultation from a trusted friend or colleague. So somebody who you view as somebody who's very experienced in what you're working with. It's perfectly okay to ask for advice, supervision. Maintain your own physical, mental, and emotional health just inside and outside of work, inside and outside of the home. And then also seek counseling or any other mental health supports for yourself when necessary. So, working with individuals who are grieving can be very overwhelming, and it's okay that you also seek counseling if you need to and prioritize yourself as well. That will help you be a better caregiver, a better practitioner.